Well, this is going to be an exciting video. Yes, it appears I am not like other girls. I prefer Silent Hill 4 over 3, and that is a very unpopular opinion these days, and I can understand why. Silent Hill 4 has its obvious flaws with its gameplay, camera angles, silly sound design, and lack of boss fights. But I can say that SH4 took such a different approach to the franchise, making that game stand out from the rest for me. It made a place like the comfort of your home a living hell. It made you the main character, hence Henry's blandness. It brought us some utterly terrifying enemies and gave us a playstyle that messed with the gameplay well. I don't want to hear people preaching that Silent Hill 4 was not supposed to be a Silent Hill game, because this game was always meant to be in the Silent Hill universe, believe it or not. Silent Hill 3, however, is a direct sequel to the first game, something that the fans were hoping to get for so long. The team had already started working on SH3 not too long after. I mean, Silent Hill 1 and 2 were big hits for Konami, so it was no surprise that they wanted to get another game out as soon as they could. This is never a good idea because you know what a rushed title gives you: a rushed story, gameplay, and a plethora of other things. Team Silent did the best with what little time they had. They needed to make something that could do even better. I'm shocked that a company like Konami pushed for another Silent Hill game, given the fact that the entire genre is niche, so you can't expect to sell super high numbers like other AAA games. That's what Konami expected, of course, and we all know where Silent Hill's fate went. While the Silent Hill franchise remains one of my favorites to this day, I still have yet to see the hype of Silent Hill 3, and that's a very bold opinion because most of the people that I know hold SH3 on a very high pedestal. Very few have derived from the popular opinion calling SH3 a bit overrated, which is a statement I find to be true, might I add. I would also like to say that I'm not calling this game garbage or sitting down talking to a microphone about how terrible this game is. I'll simply be shedding light on some opinions I have on the game that made me feel that SH3 wasn't as amazing as people set it out to be. While Silent Hill 1 and 2 coming on completely different hardware, it's only obvious they'd have very different gameplay and different settings. I think the reason why people decide to compare SH2 and 3 so much is because of their similarities in gameplay and settings. People compare them when I feel they shouldn't be compared at all. In retrospect, I think that someone like myself would appreciate SH3 more if it came out before 2. And I'm not saying that because of its graphics and whatnot, but because SH2 brought the series to a high that people simply didn't want to look past. I feel like Silent Hill 2 put the series on such a high pedestal with its symbolism and deep analysis that people already expected to see similar things presented in the third. While SH2 embraced sadness, regret, grief, and punishment, SH3 wanted violence, anger, and revenge. Silent Hill 2 is quiet, and Silent Hill 3 is screaming. So even if Team Silent took a different approach than they did, people will always criticize it. Everyone has their own opinion on whether or not Silent Hill 3 is better than 2. And I respect all opinions because I can completely understand where you come from. Let's talk about Silent Hill 3 first though. The game starts with our main protagonist, Heather Mason, who is the child Harry Mason adopted after the events that took place in the first game. I'm gonna try to explain this in the simplest way possible. There is a cult called the Order. This cult is bad and very serious about their quote-unquote religion. They're also a highlight antagonist in many of the Silent Hill games. This cult essentially wanted to birth their god, and by doing so, they decided to burn a girl named Alessa Gillespie, the daughter of Dahlia Gillespie, a profound member of the Order. They burned Alessa thinking she'd birthed their god, and guess what? It did not go as planned. Alessa wound up splitting half of her soul, which contained her good memories, to another baby. That baby would be Cheryl and would be adopted by Harry Mason. I hope you guys are still with me. I know it might be a little confusing, it took me a while too. Silent Hill 3 would bring back Cheryl. However, her name was changed to protect her from the Order. Fun fact, Cheryl got her new name from her mocap and voice actor Heather Morris. Heather finds herself at Lakeside Amusement Park without any real context and a scary rabbit mascot that's bloody and sitting on on a bench, we start the game. After Heather gets hit by a roller coaster, the dream sequence ends with Heather waking up at some sort of cafe. The orange color here reminisces the season of autumn, something the devs were purposely going for. Heather is by far one of my favorite protagonists to come out of a horror game. Some people insist that Heather has cringe dialogue, but I think that this shapes her personality greatly. You also have to put into consideration that this is a 17-year-old girl and this is set in the 2000s. She's strong-willed and brave, and she's okay with being vulnerable at times, but that doesn't let her guard down. You can't lie, she's also one of the best looking characters to come out of the PS2 era. The graphics in this game are great, the mocap is great, and the facial animations are great. This game is graphically impressive to this day. An interesting choice was taking out FMVs, which wasn't a bad idea because those do age with time. Heather continues to walk through the mall and make a call to her father, Harry Mason. After finishing the call, Heather is quickly stopped by an unknown man. This man is Douglas Cartlin. He is a detective looking into Heather's birth. Douglas doesn't seem like that much of a threat by his demeanor. However, he does come off as some creepy man preying on a young girl. We learn later that this detective was hired by someone from the Order. After Heather runs off, the mall eventually turns into the underworld. You can't forget about the bread though. I'd like to talk about puzzles generally here. Most of the puzzles are pretty literal, such as finding tongs to pick up a key if you consider that a puzzle, or putting up books and reorganizing them to get a number. This game gives you the option for the riddle level to be harder if you're looking for a challenge. Puzzles aside, the gameplay aspect pretty much stays the same. Many people would argue that SH3 is a more polished version of SH2 in terms of gameplay, but I think that they fairly run the same. Running, hitting, stopping, and running. I think the bonus stuff has improved, with Heather getting a freaking lightsaber, which is pretty awesome, you can't lie. Also, everyone's favorite, Sailor Moon-esque Heather. Princess Heart has a great transformation and her powers are super OP. As the story continues, Heather runs into another person. This person is Claudia Wolf, the main antagonist of the game. She is the highest priest of the Order, has no eyebrows so you can't tell what mood she's in, and has no shoes so we automatically know not to trust her. Claudia starts saying a whole bunch of nonsense and Heather's like, what the fuck? And Claudia's like, you must become the one to lead us to paradise. And Heather's like, what the hell is this lady on? Did you do all of this? But if Claudia's a churchgoer, then you know damn well she's gonna speak like she's saying a riddle and we have to understand what it means. Heather, let me break it down in easy terms for you. She wants you to birth God. Now, since I already explained the plot of the first game, Claudia is just continuing what would be done in the first game, or what was supposed to be done. So it's like the same plot, but not really. We know this because character Vincent, which we'll talk about more later, tells Heather that Claudia was brainwashed by that quote-unquote crazy old hag, which you might have guessed is Dahlia Gillespie. I actually didn't know this, but while refreshing my memory online, I didn't realize that Claudia actually had special powers. While reading online, it now made more sense to me why Heather would get headaches when she was around, or the possible reason behind the monsters in the mall. Claudia is a hopeless antagonist, with the thought of paradise being the only way for her to be truly happy. From the start, Claudia was already doomed with being in this cult for so long, believing in these ideologies and making her whole life dependent on it. I get that Claudia's rough childhood gives her a reason to be displeased with the world, but there's no need to get down the hill like she does. I didn't find Claudia to be one of my favorite antagonists of the series. I personally think that characters like Walter or Maria were far more interesting to uncover and were just intriguing, if that makes sense. I didn't feel the need to learn more about Claudia. I knew she was part of the Order, and I feel like that was all I really needed to know. If she's your favorite antagonist, I am sorry. I would love to hear your reasoning though on why you found her intriguing and wanted to learn more about. With many people not being fond of the whole cult story, I do feel like the whole quote-unquote rough childhood equals cultist that wants to do bad doesn't sound all that luring. After meeting Claudia, Heather heads down an elevator that brings her to the Otherworld, a recurring aspect of the Silent Hill series which wraps the regular world as you know it, adding rusted areas and monsters all around. After roaming and solving a puzzle, Heather travels down a staircase and starts to fight the first boss battle. After killing a tentacle, you magically return back to the mall. And here I'll stop to talk about a few locations. I am not a fan of most of the locations in this game. I don't feel that many of them are as memorable nor fun to play through. For example, the subway. I can understand why someone would find this creepy. The quietness, thinking someone is around when there really isn't, kind of reminds me of the NYC subway at 1 a.m. In this analogy, I'm Heather with a knife in my hand waiting for someone to just try and come at me. Like I said, not really much going on here. The only thing that really saves it is the ambience. Other places like the underpass just feel never ending and not in a good way. Just tunnels going back and forth through. Nothing cool to look at, just boring tunnels. Sometimes the walls can get bloody, which does add a spin. I don't know if it's just me, but for a big chunk of this game, many areas rarely have any enemies in them. The last two I mentioned only had a few in specific areas, but nothing as taunting where you're forced to get hit or fight them. Heather runs into a man named Vincent. Interesting character that doesn't get much screen time. Heather doesn't seem to know much about her past and why she's so special. Her father only kept these things from her to protect her, it seems. The best thing that Vincent had to offer was this amazing one-liner,
They looked like monsters to you?
which changes the whole perspective on whether or not Heather was killing monsters or people from the cult this whole time. Vincent is the priest of the order and is a big hypocrite. Throughout the game, you see Vincent playing both sides, believing in God, but not as insane as Claudia. Not saying that Vincent is completely sane anyways. Vincent does choose to help Heather, but his deeper meaning jokes, quote-unquote trusted knowledge, and manipulative tendencies hold a debate on whether or not Heather should trust him.
There's something wrong with you too.
Heather heads home and is waiting to see her dad until she sees it's too late. Harry Mason is dead. The man we played through in the first game was gone just like that. I don't know if giving him more screen time would have changed the story, but even then we're able to understand the weight of his impact on Heather. The problem is that Heather is now all alone. Thankfully, I haven't dealt with a struggle like this, but I can understand what a scene like this might mean to people. And finally realizing what it is to be all alone at one point in your life, especially at a young age. While Heather changes her demeanor after learning Claudia killed Harry, Heather still feels like the same character. Of course, she's distraught, but I don't think she loses herself. She only gets stronger. Heather is conflicted by her father's death, asking him why he had to die, and calling him a liar. After Douglas gives her Harry's notebook, we learn a lot about the struggles Harry went through raising Heather as a child. The parallel of him being conflicted himself, writing things like, could I love her? She could be that young woman who snatched away my beloved daughter. He also writes things like, but I love you. I have no doubts about that. That's why I ask you to believe. This is where the story becomes a revenge one. Heather needs to go to her childhood place to end this, to kill Claudia in Silent Hill. We get to go back to the town we just played in Silent Hill 2. Was this actually for the plot? Or did the team have short time restraints so they use the same locations? Side note, I know the horror franchise is niche, but with the success of SH2, Konami should have given the team more funding and time to make SH3 even better. It makes sense for devs to reutilize assets, and I'll say they did do some altering with Brookhaven, but in this case, Heather going to Silent Hill's original Alchemilla Hospital would have made more sense. If you're doing a continuation to 1, places like the elementary school as a full entry level would have been great. While there are nods to the first game, I wish we would have got more out of some places. I'd like to point out that the inclusion of Heaven's Knight kind of puts a spin on Maria's character from SH2, believing that she was around long before James. I'm sure there was a Maria and then James just manifested Mary into her, which would make sense as to why Heather sees this. While searching for Claudia, Heather is told to look for the seal of Metatron, which is supposed to repel God. This is where we talk to Leonard Wolf, the father of Claudia. Leonard was abusive to Claudia, hence her upbringing.
I saw the way he hit you, kicked you, and made you cry.
Leonard is trying to help Heather because he thinks they're on the same page. Heather travels through the nowhere cameo, and this is where I had a big problem with the game. Now, it might just be me, but I was playing on a compatible PS3. When I tell you the bloody walls were extremely blurry and hurt my eyes so badly that I struggled to get through this level. I found one picture in a forum that resembled what I was going through. I don't know if anyone else has had this issue, but man, it made it a bummer to go through most of these parts. I've seen some 4K playthroughs of this game, and I can say that the walls look cool as hell. That and the concept as a whole. What's even crazier is that I heard that your health depletes in hard mode the longer you stay near them. They're really sucking the blood out of you. Ha, ha, ha. One of my favorite areas is where Heather is running from gated doors. It's a pretty small part, but it adds to that ambience of truly going down and getting even more stuck into the abyss. We also get a little callback to Lisa here, which is cool. Heather goes up a ladder to come across some really good imagery of a monster spinning a wheel as we look up at a nurse facing down. It's like the monster was spinning the wheel to start something else for us. Maybe more bloody walls? After making it into the sewers, we finally meet Leonard, but he is not a normal human. He is a monster. Leonard finds out that while Heather doesn't think like Claudia, she doesn't think like him either. This scene is kind of funny because Heather is so unfazed talking to a shadow in the sewers, and even after he reveals his full identity, all she does is say,
Is every person here a mental case?
Leonard quoted that he'll kill Heather with a gruesome death, even though he's slow as hell, and Heather just shotguns him back into the water. After killing Leonard and getting the seal, Heather goes up to meet with Douglas and instead meets Vincent's lying ass that just spoke to Claudia, even though he tells Heather he didn't. Heather knows he's lying, but she honestly just wants to get this over with. She's told to head to the church by going through the amusement park. When she gets there, she starts getting pains in her stomach, calling back to the themes of birth. This is also me when I get cramps in my stomach, so I'd say it's just calling back to being a woman in general. The amusement park area, which was also featured in SH1, features graded loud floors, Robbie the Rabbit everywhere, and a roller coaster coming straight at Heather, which she happens to miss this time. I might be a bit biased, but since I love amusement parks, I'll give this level a pass, no doubt. Once a creepy old man Heather had to deal with, to a man who is actually not that bad and willing to die to help Heather. Douglas confronts Claudia on her lies and is about to kill her, but he doesn't. I don't know if this next part was necessary, but I will say it's cool though. Heather travels through a haunted house that's not that scary. Ah! Run, Heather, run, please keep going, run, I don't want to. Please keep running, Heather. Heather, please run, please run, please run. Heather, please keep running, Heather, please run. Keep on going, come on, please, you could do this, please. After finding poor Douglas with a broken leg, he almost kills Heather, thinking that that's the easier option, but doesn't pull the trigger again. We go through a silly horse puzzle, which to this day I don't understand, and then we see the one and only memory of Alessa. I would argue that this is probably one of the highlight boss fights in this whole game. We have the carousel converted into a falling elevator as the horses shake in terror. It's also easily a callback to SH1 and its Sybil boss battle. The fire in the middle only makes it cooler. Will it be crazy to say that I actually don't remember all of this going on in my first playthrough of the game? I think they did a lot of cool detailing for this part, and I can't imagine what Heather must be going through trying to kill an enemy that looks exactly like her. To this day, no one fully knows if Heather is Alessa here or she's just saying these things to get over Claudia. But if that's the case, then Heather is a genius. Also, the church is very pretty, might I add. We're almost near the end when we finally make it to Alessa's room. We go through Alessa's room and uncover some notes from Harry while simultaneously running through bloody floors and walls. After collecting tarot cards and going through Alessa's room, it is time. The showdown is where Vincent tells Heather to kill that crazy bitch named Claudia. Yet instead, Claudia does a 360 and stabs him in the back, killing him. Claudia is ready for God to be born. However, Heather sends her great quote by saying, "But a God from hatred can never create a perfect paradise." An interesting event is to see past characters from Silent Hill as such a horrible place, and even Heather sees it that way too. Claudia, on the other hand, sees it as a paradise. But is it a paradise if the person who's supposed to be birthing God doesn't even see it that way? Heather opens up a pendant given by her father, and this is another birth theme, implying that the pill is supposed to resemble birth control or abortion in general. After Heather spits out God, Claudia eats it. Ew! I also find it funny that before this scene you can just go up to Claudia and stare at her and Vincent's body on the floor without doing anything. Claudia becomes God and Heather must now defeat her. This boss fight is pretty I don't know, it's pretty Claudia doesn't move anywhere other than up and down. There is fire that comes up from the floor that forces you to move side to side, but there's not much that's going on for the most of it. A few hits later and God is dead. This is another one of my highlights in the game. Heather says,
Is that the end? I guess it's time to roll the credits.
I just love the subtle touch of breaking the fourth wall. Like us, Heather wants to know if it's done too. This is where we also see Heather properly break down and just relive some of that built up emotion she had about her father's death. Heather cries for her father, not caring about anything else, but fully realizing that he's gone forever. It's a really touching moment, and while Heather can just sit there in sorrow forever, she decides to get up and continue her journey. At the end, Heather fully comes to terms with herself, even feeling comfortable enough to call herself by her real name, which is Cheryl. In just a few hours, we've seen Heather go from a teenage girl to her first steps in womanhood. A truly touching moment. We also get to see her silly little self still.
Is it really over?
Not yet. You're still alive.
Heather. What Heather?
Just a joke.
You've got terrible taste.
Sorry.
And wow, that's the end of the game. It kind of sounds like I've been saying a lot of good things about it. Look, I never said that I hated the game, it's just not one of my favorites in the series. But that doesn't mean that it fully lacks any redeeming qualities. Since we've made it to my final thoughts, I'd like to start off with Heather Mason. As I've said before, I think that Heather is a great protagonist, and her being the only female one in the series makes her a standout even more. She's truly defined the teenage girl for that time, and the whole team wrote her as spot on as they could. It's crazy to think that even 20 years after this game's release, a lot of these issues that Heather goes through for just being a woman are still prevalent today. I lose my temper a lot like Heather, so I'm happy we have something in common. From Heather having to deal with creepy men alone, to having a knife in her inventory for self-defense before any monsters appear, or even having a stun gun in her drawer. Things like this are things women have to constantly do to protect themselves. As a female who grew up in New York City and takes transportation alone a lot of the time, carrying a small knife or pepper spray is a default. Just because I'm a woman and you always have to be prepared for what can happen. It's honestly a really sad thing that we have to deal with this. So in that sense, I do understand Heather's struggle, and the good parenting on Harry's side, of course. I also love the whole fear aspect coming to life. For example, we learn early on that Heather doesn't like mirrors, and later in the game, this happens. A really cool clip that shows our deep fears coming to life in the worst way possible. Let's move on to enemies. I don't want to say that the enemies felt like they lacked those deep themes, because then I'll sound like a hypocrite with my don't compare statement, but what I will say is that enemies gave their symbolic message in a much more literal form compared to 2. With a lot of themes surrounding birth, R-word, and sexual undertones, I don't even know what I think this looks like. I don't care what you say, this little guy is a sperm. This enemy is called the Slurper, and it looks like it's wearing boxers. Do I need to elaborate on that? Split worm looks like a mix between a, you know what? I'm not even gonna say it. What I will say is that I was sad about how literal a lot of these enemies are. Even when playing this game for the first time, these enemies all gave a sexual undertone. With Silent Hill 2, I feel that characters like Red Pyramid Thing and Fleshlip let you think out of the box for a little bit about how to interpret those enemies, and what they stood for. I'd like to mention that Silent Hill 3 didn't have a standout enemy or boss fight. You can't count the nurses because we've already seen those. Nobody remembers the missionary because it wasn't that good of a boss fight. But to be honest, none of the boss battles in Silent Hill are that good anyway. Split Worm is like a 30-second battle if you just start shooting when you get the chance. Closers and numb bodies are usually thrown at you in packs of more than one, so you don't have time to appreciate them as you would mannequins. Pendulums are fucking annoying and they sound atrocious. I don't care what you have to say to defend those guys, you must like bleeding ears. Enemies like the missionary, the memory of Alessa, if you truly consider her an enemy, and God herself were all cool enemies, don't get me wrong. I just don't think they had time to shine or leave any type of impact. Like, you're telling me the bunny mascot is more iconic than any of the actual enemies you fight? How ironic is it that people probably remember an enemy like Twin Victims in SH4 compared to Insane Cancer? It just goes to show you how impactful an enemy design can be. There are a plethora of weapons in this game, with the addition of some pretty cool ones such as a katana and, as I mentioned before, a lightsaber. Who wouldn't love to play with a lightsaber? There are also some cool hidden details like the sewer fairy, which will grant you a golden pipe to kill your enemies with. Your best weapon in the game for your first playthrough will most likely be your shotgun. It's your most practical one. Also, there is beef jerky to keep the enemies distracted. Don't pick it up. I don't even know why it's a thing. I never use it. You can beat the enemies to death instead. The game has fewer endings than the previous title, with only 3 this time. The normal ending, which is canon, the possessed ending, which has Heather possessed and killing Douglas, and the famous UFO ending, of course, which is a little silly joke ending, which has you see some familiar faces. The soundtrack and ambience are prime factors in this game. The ambience is played very well throughout the playthrough and keeps you uneasy when walking through the simplistic areas. If some of those spaces did not have ambience, I don't know if they could have been saved. And the soundtrack, the first SH soundtrack to feature vocals and deliver a smash hit titled You're Not Here, featuring Mary McGlynn, who would later feature in a few other songs. There are a lot of bangers in this soundtrack, and that's a no-brainer. Akira continues to give good work as always. Never Forgive Me, Never Forget Me. Those first few notes are iconic to anyone that hears it. Well, that was a summary of the game and just some of my underlying thoughts on it. Like I said, I don't hate this game, but it's just not one of my favorites. I don't know if I'll play this game anytime soon, just because I didn't enjoy playing it in the playthroughs that I've done. But who knows, maybe it will grow on me. As much as I don't like this game, I weirdly can speedrun it in a lot of the areas. It's like it's ingrained in my head for some reason, I don't know why. Maybe there's something in the bread. Ha ha ha. If you want to keep the conversation going and maybe know more about my thoughts on this game, write a comment down below on how you feel about Silent Hill 3 and if you had any problems with it. I know I highlighted a lot of good things about this game because in my reviews I don't like to be 100% biased and completely throw trash on a game, because that's just not what I do. I simply wanted to tell you about the game, some things that I liked about it, but some cons that I have with it compared to the other games. So yeah, write your thoughts below and let me know how you feel about this game. I will hopefully see you in the next video. Peace. This is where we also see Heather properly break down and just relive some of that built up This is where fucking noises. This is where we also see Heather